The Lost Year, Chapter 4, Teachings. Scathane Dragon was a font of knowledge. If Merlin had 200 years just to read, she would not have made it all the way through the library. Sadly, time was not her friend. There was no real way to mask their presence here. Chimneys made to look like dragons from the outside had begun to smoke for the first time in years. They did have one advantage, though. Merlin was very familiar with the patrols sent out of Camelot. With all the destruction wrought by the dragon a few months ago, the patrols had been scarce on the ground, and since this area was largely uninhabited on the Camelot side of the border, only the odd wanderer would likely even see the smoke. She guessed they had a week at best before some word reached Camelot of the awakening of the old fortress. Then a few more days, at best, as the patrol was sent out. Leon had told her about the shortcut through the tunnels full of wildren he and Arthur had cut through to get to her when she was taken in Morgana's place, but Merlin seriously doubted a full patrol of knights would risk that on a rumor of an old fortress they could not actually access coming to life. She did shave a few days off her estimation to account for Uther's suspicion, but it still gave them enough time to go through some of the old fortress. Balinor set aside a stack of books for her, assuring her there was a way to hide them from scrutiny. But he also led her deeper into the fortress. There were many rooms here, wings that had once held families, tunnels into the mountains themselves where the dragons had lived, storerooms full of odd artifacts Merlin would love to go through. They stayed in what had been his home. It was modest, since he'd been living there alone since his father passed, and passed on the gift. He'd been a teacher. Kilgara had apparently been hatched many generations ago by one of her ancestors. Balinor's own dragon, the one he'd hatched, had been killed in the massacre Uther had perpetrated. She had barely been a hatchling. Balinor planned to go through the caves in the next few years and see if there were any eggs left behind. He would have to do it sporadically in case Camelot did send a patrol, but he was determined to see if he could save the species. Merlin thought that was a wonderful goal, but this trip he was focusing on teaching her.
This is a skill that is wildly useful and simple,
he said, unrolling a map with a puff of dust. He opened a small chest, only slightly larger than his fist, and held it out to Merlin. It was full of pointed crystals and delicate chains.
Pick one,
he instructed. Merlin frowned, but selected a purple crystal shot through with white, hanging on a silver chain. The chain ended in a bead made of the same crystal. What is it? She asked, running a finger over the smooth surface of the crystal. It was only about the length of her pinky finger and not much wider.
A scrying crystal. There are different ways to do it. The easiest way is the one I'm going to show you now,
he said, gesturing to the map. He picked up a crystal from the chest. This one was red, with a gold chain. Holding it between his middle and index finger, he let it dangle over the map.
The trick is to focus on an object or person, one you're not sure of their whereabouts. The point of this type of scrying is to find them. Focus on the object of your search and speak the word Kardak.
As he said the word, his eyes glowed gold, and the crystal dangling above the page moved until the tip was pointing towards the mountains of Askaroth near Gawain. Who were you thinking of? She asked, grinning.
Kilgara,
Balinor said, and pulled the crystal away from the page. Makes sense he's hiding somewhere near Camelot. Merlin said with a wry grin. Balinor laughed.
True. From what your mother told me, you have a habit of getting into trouble,
he said, his tone only slightly chiding. Merlin's grin turned rueful.
Your turn. Focus on someone you know, but you're not sure where they are,
he instructed, and Merlin held up the crystal as her father had done. For a moment, she wasn't sure who to focus on. Most of the people she knew were in Camelot. But then a thought occurred to her. One person she truly trusted but had not seen in near half a year, not since he'd helped rescue her from Hengist. Focusing on Lancelot's face in her mind, she spoke the word, and the crystal moved, the tip pointing to a small town near the border of Camelot, Anged. That's not too far from here, Merlin said with a grin. Balinor smiled back.
Who were you thinking of?
He asked. Merlin grinned as she explained Lancelot's story. Balinor nodded, rolling up the map.
He sounds like a wonderful friend to have.
He grinned and pushed a book towards Merlin.
Now, there is another way to scry. It's slightly more difficult, but was once more popular since it gives an actual image. It requires a few things we don't have, though,
he said, tapping the page. Looking it over, Merlin nodded. The spell required a natural water source. A well was a good place to begin. But the water had to rise from the earth naturally, or the image would be distorted. The focusing crystal would be deposited into the water source, and an enchantment spoken over the whole thing. It would only last until the crystal was removed. If it was never removed, the site would become a scrying well long after the original caster passed. Anyone with magic could use these with just a simple scrying incantation and focus.
That's yours now,
Balinor said, gesturing to the crystal.
I trust you know to hide it well,
he said with a small, sad smile. Merlin nodded. Yes. Not sure how I'm going to hide any of those books, though, Merlin said with a smile of her own.
We have our ways,
Balinor said, his smile growing. We were traveling to see family in Angad, my lord, the man explained before the court. It's a dangerous journey at the best of times, but then we saw the smoke rising from the edge of the mountains of Isgard. There've always been old legends about those mountains, sire, the man said, wringing his hands. Uther nodded.
Thank you for bringing this to the court,
he said with a dismissive nod. The man bowed and scurried away. The mountains of Isgard are uninhabited, Arthur said with a frown.
Perhaps the smoke from a campfire,
he suggested. Uther turned to Gaius. The legends of the mountain.
Is it true?
He asked, ignoring his son.
Scathane Dragon was rumored to be somewhere in the mountains of Isgard. Once upon a time, sire,
Gaius confirmed.
Scathane Dragon?
Arthur asked as Uther paced.
The ancient home of the dragonlords. It was their home along with their dragons. It was long said to be a place of learning and great power,
Gaius explained. We never found it. We knew the majority of the dragonlords lurked within Camelot's borders, but we never found the fortress, Uther said, turning to Arthur. Take a patrol with all haste to the mountains of Isgard. Seek out the source of this smoke, he ordered, and Arthur nodded, making quick eye contact with Leon across the room. Uther dismissed the court, and Arthur followed Gaius out of the room. He'd been right about the Knights of Medir. Arthur needed to know what he might be leading his men into.
What do the legends say about Scathane Dragon?
He asked, and Gaius frowned.
The powers of a dragonlord could not be learned. They were passed through the bloodline. With Balinor dead, there should be no one who would know the truth of Scathane Dragon,
he said, his eyebrow already halfway up. Arthur glanced around the physician's chambers and closed the door to make sure they weren't overheard. If Balinor was less than dead, could he hurt Camelot from this place? Arthur asked. Gaius blinked.
No. As I told your father, it was always said to be a place of learning, of teaching between dragons and dragonlords,
Gaius assured. Arthur frowned. Could it be where Morgause is holding Morgana? Arthur asked, almost hopeful. Gaius shook his head again.
The old legends say only the dragonlords knew how to enter and leave Scathane Dragon. Morgause has no blood ties to those old lines. I do not believe so, no. The old legends say that the only way in or out of the fortress is to fly,
Gaius said, and Arthur's eyes went wide. So all this may be pointless, he asked, huffing. Gaius nodded.
It is possible.
Arthur sighed, nodded his thanks to Gaius, and left. Gaius frowned, eyes tracking up to Merlin's room, empty now for nearly 3 weeks. He hoped she wasn't in trouble, but an old feeling of unease told him that the illness had likely taken Huneth. The quake that had blocked the pass of Estir had been far-reaching but not widely destructive. There had not been a quake in that area in living memory. He suspected it was unnatural in nature, and Merlin's powers got out of hand when she was in emotional distress. Her mother's death would have caused that. Now the home of the dragonlords was smoking again? It couldn't be coincidence. Her father, who he already knew had lived, had most likely headed to Eldor when he'd escaped. He would have been there when Huneth died. Perhaps he had wanted to share something of his side of the family with his daughter. Gaius left a candle burning in the window that night, hoping against hope he wasn't right.